everyone. My name's Dr. Nicola Williams. I'm a lecturer in the ethics of human reproduction at Lancaster University, and it's my absolute pleasure to introduce you to today's webinar, brought to you by the Wellcome-funded Future of Human Reproduction project. This is the first of a series of webinars in which different members of our team are joined by some special guests and share some of the work we've been undertaking and questions we've been tackling over the last 3 years as part of our Wellcome-funded Research Development Award. Now, today's rather timely topic, given the HFEA statement on IVG published yesterday, and the importance placed on public engagement regarding IVG, is in vitro gametogenesis. What issues does it raise? And I'm joined today by Professor Stephen Wilkinson, Distinguished Professor of Bioethics at Lancaster University and Principal Investigator of the Future of Human Reproduction project, and Sarah Norcross, the Director of the Progress Educational Trust, an independent charity which aims to educate and debate the responsible application of reproductive and genomic science. Before we hear from Steve and Sarah, however, I want to take you through a few housekeeping issues to let you know that firstly, this webinar is going to be recorded and shared online at a later date. And secondly, to let you know about the format of today's session. So we'll shortly begin with an introduction from Steve into the research topic theme and the Future of Human Reproduction project. Steve and Sarah will then spend around 15 to 20 minutes discussing some of the key ethical, legal and social questions and concerns raised by in vitro gametogenesis. And then we're going to open up to Q&A from the audience. Now, anyone who'd like to ask a question is therefore invited to post this in the event Q&A section. And I'll be moderating this alongside my colleagues Zinzi Questwell and Laura O'Donovan. And we'll try to ask Steve and Sarah as many questions as we have time for during this part of the session. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Steve to introduce the topic and the FOHR project. Thanks.
Thank you very much, and thanks everybody for being here. So Nicola mentioned the Future of Human Reproduction project, so I'll say a little bit about that first. This is a Wellcome-funded research project which looks at, if like, bioethical issues, but from a very multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary perspective. So we bring together colleagues from bioethics, design, English literature, law, linguistics, and psychology to try and sort of look at these things in a slightly different way. And the project has three focal technologies which it's been looking at to differing extents. One of them is what's sometimes called ectogenesis, or artificial wombs is another expression which is used, which is looking at technologies which allow us to gestate fetuses, eventually babies, outside the human body. So we're not talking about that today, but that's one of our topics. The second one we look at is sort of genome editing in a reproductive context, and the third one is today's topic, which is in vitro gametogenesis, which is shortened to IVG. So I'll just say a little bit about what that is. This is going to be a non-technical explanation, largely because I am non-technical. So in vitro gametogenesis, IVG, refers to a set of technologies which allow us to create sperm or eggs from cells which are not reproductive organs. So I guess in the standard case, for animals, sperm come from testicles, testes, eggs come from ovaries. IVG enables us to create either sperm or eggs from other bodily cells. So if it works, when it works, you could, for example, take a skin cell from an animal or from a human and create a sperm or an egg from it using stem cell technology. So this, I won't get into the details of this, but this does allow a number of possibilities which you might already have thought of. I mean, first of all, it would be potentially very useful reproductive treatment for people whose reproductive organs have been damaged or lost. So it could be used in that context. it would also enable other possibilities, which we might well come on to later, such as enabling a sperm to be created from a female body, and vice versa, enabling an egg to be created from a male body. So it could potentially, in the future, might open up those possibilities. So that's IVG. We're just using it as a term to cover all those technologies that enable us to create sperm or eggs in this sort of a non-standard way from other bodily cells. So that's probably all you need to know from me now. But I would like to just hand over to my colleague, Sarah Norcross. Very, very nice to have you here, Sarah. And perhaps you'd like to say a few words about yourself and PET.
Thanks very much, Steve. So, yes, I'm Sarah Norcross, and I'm the director of PET, Progress Educational Trust, which is, as Nicola said, an independent charity, and we really like to look at the cutting edge scientific developments affecting reproduction and also genomics. And I think we've been looking at thinking about this sort of creating gametes outside the body for quite some time. And what was really interesting is, in looking back in my preparation for this, my my poor memory, shall we say, was jogged that actually we'd done something on what we were then calling artificial gametes back in 2008 in Newcastle, because some work was being done there at the time, and it was also at the time when the Human Fertilisation and Embryology Act was being updated. So it's interesting that these discussions about these technologies have been going on for a considerable amount of time, and every so often, because of a scientific development, we get a little bit more excited about them, and the public and the press get more excited about them. And I think that's why it's really timely that we're having this discussion today, given the fact that this issue has been in the Guardian yesterday, and it was on BBC Radio 4's flagship news programme, the Today programme, just this morning. So perfect timing, Steve. I don't know how your team quite did that, but great.
Great. Thanks very much, Sarah.
Yeah, so I suppose what we've had so far is you've given us a little bit of an introduction to what IVG is and how it's been in the news in the last few days, given the HFEA report. And so I was just wondering, could you tell me about IVG and how it might be different or similar to currently available reproductive technologies? And if so, kind of who would use IVG and why it might be chosen over other available options?
Who's going to go first? Do you want to go first, Sarah?
You go first, Steve, and then I'll chip in at the end.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Well, I think I generally think of, IVG. There's probably three main, sort of, in very general terms, there's probably three types of use. So one use of IVG would be to, I suppose, replace or complement things which are already happening. So, for example, you could, if IVG, this might be a long way down the road technically, but if IVG became very, very safe and effective and cheap and so on, you might imagine it replacing some of the processes that are used in the context of regular IVF. So in particular, egg extraction, it might be that it's easier, safer to use IVG. So rather than having to remove an egg from a woman, you could use IVG and take a skin cell instead and create eggs that way. Now, I say that's probably a long way down the road technically, but it's something that's been discussed. So we had a meeting, which Sarah was also at, in the Netherlands earlier this year, and to talk about IVG, and it was that was put forward by some of the sort of more technical people there as something that's clearly a possibility. So that's an example, and it could also be used for anybody who currently wants or needs donor egg or donor sperm. It could replace those practices, and it then means obviously that the people concerned are sort of genetically related to their children rather than having that donor relationship. So that's a couple of sort of things where we already do something, but IVG could replace it or complement it perhaps in a way. I suppose the second kind of practice, and sorry, this might be a slightly long answer, a second kind of practice is enabling new types of family So I won't go on about this at great length because we might come back to it, but one of the ones which gets talked about the most is the possibility of same-sex biological or genetic parents. So if two females can between them produce a sperm and an egg, and one of them does the gestation, pregnancy, and childbirth, then that's, you could have a two female couple which was, you know, fully kind of self-contained, if you like, biologically, and could create its own, or they could create their own child without any donors or anything like that. So same-sex biological relatedness is possible. That could also happen for two males, but they would need, at the moment, surrogacy in order to sort of gestate the fetus. So it would enable that. And there are other possibilities as well that we might come on to, but it enables more family forms. And finally, I suppose it could be used in different ways to facilitate more selection of embryos. So famously, Hank Greeley, the American bioethicist, who's written a book called The End of Sex and the Future of Human Reproduction, I think, talks about what he calls easy PGD is the expression he uses. And the idea is IVG may make it possible to produce really large numbers of embryos, which then enables much more sort of nuanced and extensive selection amongst that pool of embryos to select characteristics. I'm not suggesting this is necessarily a good thing, but he argues that this is, you know, one of the things that IVG might facilitate. So to summarise, IVG could be used in, if you like, a fairly conservative way, just to sort of help with existing practices. It could be, number two, it could be used more radically to create new family forms, such as same-sex biologically related families. And finally, as Greeley has suggested, that it could be used as a gateway to sort of more selection of embryos. So those are some of the things that we might use it for.
And just to add that, I suppose that does open the possibility of women who are post-normal menopausal age being able to have a genetically related child if they haven't chosen to freeze their eggs, or it may obviate the need to freeze your eggs. And then there are the different family forms that Steve has talked about. So multiplex parenting, as it's often called. So where there are 4 genetically related people rather than just 2, and also what we at PET call auto reproduction, where the sperm and the egg are created from just one person. And I think, you know, as you, the people on this call, can imagine, some of those things get a lot more press attention and topical discussion than others. And I think, you know, you asked Nicola about, you know, the sort of similarities. So that, you know, there's a striking similarity with what we do at the moment, in that this will all be done in the, if it's done in the UK at all, within the licensed clinic. But before we get anywhere near putting in vitro derived gametes back into a person, then we would need to have a law change. But there's also another way of using them which may not require a law change, and that is if in vitro derived gametes are created in the lab but then put directly back, transplanted back into the person's ovaries or testis, and they go on, then, you know, that enables them to have a child naturally. So that would not, as I understand it, come under the Human Fertilisation and Embryology Act, but would be more subject for something for the Human Tissue Authority to look at.
Super. So you've spoken quite a lot about the potential treatment uses of in vitro derived gametes, but are there many research applications for which they could be used?
Do you want to go first, Sarah, on this?
Well, there are different research applications that can be used, whether to, you know, to further our understanding of the gametes of meiosis, whether they can then be used to think about testing in relation to if a mother is taking if a woman rather is taking a particular drug, or a man is taking a particular drug, what effect that might have on their gametes. So there are these different applications along those lines that I can think of. But Steve, you've perhaps got some more ideas.
No, I don't have a lot to add really on that. I mean, it's potentially a very interesting and useful kind of research tool, and in particular in case of eggs, it would mean that you didn't eggs for research wouldn't then need to come from an actual person, which obviously has some cost and risk associated with it. So that would be very valuable in that sense. But yeah, lots of research applications, and probably they're going to come on stream way before clinical applications in humans, which could be a long way off.
Yeah, so it seems like from what you're saying that the potential of IVG is that it could essentially prove transformative when it comes to reproductive practices. So it could obviate the need to use gamete donors. It could transform kind of the procurement practices that we currently use. So when do you think that it might become available for clinical use?
I think if I knew that, Nicola, I'd also be able to predict the winning lottery numbers every week. I think it's really difficult to with this, there's got to be a proof of more proofs of concept, and then when we think about the safety and efficacy of this, that is going to be a huge amount of work, and sort of thinking how long it took for say mitochondrial donation to be proof of concept, etc., to getting anywhere near clinical application. Even once the law was changed to permit it, it wasn't then next week the clinic in Newcastle can start doing it. And also I'd expect to see, if it comes at all, very much a phased, I suppose, implementation of this, because we've sort of been in our excitement talking about all these things and lumping them together, but some are much more scientifically complicated than others. So to create a sperm from a woman is not going to happen at the same time as producing an egg from a man, for example. So it's going to be a long path, I think.
Okay, so we think that perhaps some of the more kind of rosy predictions about timeframes are a little premature.
Well, if I could just chip, yeah, yes. I mean, my answer is going to fundamentally be like Sarah's, which is that I don't know, but I mean, Sarah and I probably both go to various meetings where people who are more in the science camp do make predictions. I mean, when the Guardian report from 2023, which was when the sort of headline "Mice with Two Fathers" came out. I mean, so Hayashi, the scientist who led that Japanese work, said it could be available for clinical application in humans in 10 years. I mean, we've been to meetings where people are even more optimistic than that, although I would say most people that speak on it that I've heard, who you would expect to know because they're from the science community, are more skeptical, because obviously the significant differences between mice and humans, but also more importantly the kind of safety requirements in human reproduction would quite rightly be, at least in the context of the UK and similar countries, be quite rigorous and difficult to satisfy. So there'd have to be a very extensive set of preclinical research taking place before we got anywhere near it. I suppose one thing it's worth noting, though, is obviously the world is a kind of diverse place in terms of the ways in which reproductive technologies are regulated, and clearly some people really want to use this technology either because they want it to overcome infertility, or because they want to have what we talked earlier about, a same-sex biological family. And so if some people with a lot of resources want that to happen, they might be able to try it in a different regulatory environment outside the UK. Often these things will happen elsewhere, but so that's a sort of, that's an argument in favour. I think it might be sooner rather than later, but in terms of happening here in the UK in a sort of regulated environment, I think it could be quite a long way off for those reasons.
And actually, Nicola, going back to I was saying about the PET event in 2008, the reason that we had that event was because it was thought then to be just around the corner, and efforts were being made that were led by Dr. Evan Harris, who was an MP at the time, to introduce an amendment to permit this for when it became possible. And now, yeah, that was more than 10 years ago now. So, yeah.
Okay, super. So what do you both think are the key ethical and policy issues that are associated with developing and using IVG for human reproduction?
Well, the overarching ones have got to be demonstrating safety and efficacy, because if it doesn't work and if it's not safe, then the other ethical issues fall away because we aren't going to do it. But Steve, if you want to sort of then move on from those.
Yeah, totally agree. Obviously, yeah, there's a kind of baseline ethical issue about is it safe enough, and which isn't a sort of, which is actually a complicated question technically and philosophically, because there's questions about what do we compare it to, what practices do we have now which are as safe or not as safe, and because in IVG is, well, at least some cases of IVG are mostly about trying to give people a kind of genetic relationship with their children that they might not otherwise have if they use some other thing like gamete donation or adoption or something. And so thinking about, how much weight do you attach to the value of that relationship in assessing the pros and cons is potentially quite complicated. I mean, the other issues are, it's a really diverse set of issues that are raised. Sarah, for example, mentioned earlier the possibility of women who are much older having a child from their own eggs created from IVG. I mean, that seems to me to be quite a positive ethical case for that in terms of equalising the positions of the sexes. People might find it objectionable for various ways, but I can see a really strong equalities argument there, because obviously, men have been known to create children using their own sperm well into their 80s. So if they can do it, then maybe we should think about equalizing things using this technology. I guess the thing about novel family forms is interesting. I mean, again, seems to me there's some quite positive equalities arguments for thinking that we should facilitate same-sex families and other different types of families, again with the massive caveat that the technology has to be safe. So again, there's some positive arguments around there about why IVG might be quite sort of emancipatory. There might be issues down the line about things like whether it should be publicly funded, whether it has the same status as IVF from the perspective of public funding, or whether we should regard it as something that's more elective and less core to the publicly funded health system. I guess, again, you might distinguish there between cases where it's used for the alleviation of infertility, where it's looking more like, if not a medical treatment, a sort of a way of overcoming infertility, versus using it for some other purpose, such as making a multiplex family, which one could argue perhaps is more a matter of choice. But again, I think these things can all be challenged. I don't know. What interesting to see what Sarah thinks about the novel biological family forms and how the issues there kind of come out.
I think we have to sort of go back to thinking about the welfare of the family, of the child rather, which is included in the Act, and and how that may impact, and think about what responsibilities these people have, because at the moment, we're very much, everything's sort of geared around one or two parents or a blended family, not for people perhaps being constantly involved in decision making for a child throughout its life. And I think that then we need to think about, who has responsibility, what impacts that can have if there's a disagreement between them, and there's whether it's not divorce or separation or whatever it is. And I think those things are, again, to be, as I often like to talk about these things as being messy, and it's the more people that you have involved in something, the more likely it is, obviously, that someone's going to disagree, and that can be over something such as how old should they be when they get their first mobile, to something, well, actually, this, we want them brought up in, to following a particular religion. They're all sort of football team. In my family, it would be far more important if they supported the wrong team. But that's, so there are all these different issues to it to sort of think about, and I think that could be quite challenging. And when you look at some of the cases where this has been done informally without IVGs, that have ended up in court, and seen how those sort of fall apart, it's quite perhaps quite concerning.
And are there any other kind of ethical concerns related, for example, to consent? So there has been some talk, for example, about kind of gamete theft and worries about posthumous conception. So what are your thoughts on those?
Yes, I think, yes, this technology, I mean, one risk of this technology, as you've alluded to, Nicola, there is it could be used to create sperm or eggs from people non-consensually. So essentially the idea would be if it were to become relatively easy to create a sperm or an egg from quite a small tissue sample, then if somebody can get hold of your tissue sample, then they could create a sperm or an egg and use it to create a child, against your will or without your consent. I mean, in a way, that's not ethically complicated. That just seems to be wrong to me. It's just because of the lack of consent. But there might be issues around how do we prevent this from happening? It becomes very, very, very easy. Do we need a kind of regulatory or policing system that will specifically, criminalize and prevent and deter this sort of behaviour? So there'd be more sort of practical questions like that about how you stop that from happening. I think the ethics of it's probably quite simple. There could be ethical issues which parallel some of the ethical issues that arise in the case of donor conception. So, I mean, going back to this multiplex parenting idea, I mean, if one of the progenitors was akin to a donor in a way, so they made some kind of contribution but didn't intend to be part of the social family, but if they only made a 25% contribution or 12.5% contribution, should the child have the same kind of rights of information and access that a donor conceived child would have now? I mean, possibly yes, but it's a question that could be raised. So there are those additional factors, and people do, I think, worry about this idea of gamete theft that this technology could, in a very future scenario, facilitate.
I think, as Steve has quite rightly said, I think a lot of that issue about gamete theft can be overcome through regulation and treatment in a licensed clinic. It's not like you're going to be able to just get this done on the high street. It's going to be incredibly difficult scientifically, I think, to do. But the questions about posthumous, we already tie ourselves in knots about those, where a couple are going through fertility treatment and one unfortunately dies and they haven't specified and signed the right consent forms from the HFEA. So that is more of an issue. So I think that PET would hope anyway that the issues and roadblocks around posthumous conception are tidied up when the HFEA Act next comes before Parliament, so that we don't see so many of these cases having to go to court, which doesn't seem like the right solution in these sort of often very tragic cases. So I think that it could be that part of the discussions could be part of this broader piece of law reform.
So to what extent then do you both think that the ethical and regulatory questions raised by IVG essentially kind of mirror those that already exist regarding existing reproductive technologies, or whether they're more distinctive?
Yes. Shall I go? It's a mix. I think it's a mixture. I mean, I think most of the issues most of the issues raised by IVG, most of the ethical issues raised by IVG, are not fundamentally different from issues we've had in other contexts. The questions about what it takes for a consent to be adequate and valid, how much information should people get, welfare of families, welfare of the child, and safety. Those crucially important issues which come up every time you get a new sort of reproductive technology, which is not to say they don't have to be revisited and refreshed and contextualized every time a new one comes along, but I don't think they're fundamentally different in form. The new stuff with IVG is I think again it's about the possibility of biological family forms that have not hitherto been possible, and do they raise any special issues? Should they be permitted, encouraged, facilitated, funded, banned? So those questions are quite specifically IVG. So the multiplex parenting, auto reproduction. I quite like this term, auto reproduction. I might start using it now, which is also sometimes called solo reproduction, where one person provides the sperm and the egg, and there are some kind of technical and safety reasons why that may well not be a good idea, but it's it's a theoretical possibility. So those are quite new sort of scenarios. And I think equalizing the ages is potentially a big one as well. I mean, that could lead to, so if women could have their own sort of genetic children at a much older age, I think that could, in the fullness of time, lead to quite significant sort of social change. So I'd be interested to see how that goes. So I think those are the new bits. But I mean, but there's lots of familiar issues that we know from other context, and that's good in a way because we can learn from models and from mistakes made in the past.
And I think when also I suppose the ethical issues, if it is possible to create IVGs from a single person at scale and therefore make embryos at scale, then it opens ethical questions about, well, how many embryos should we be creating for these people, to have enough viable embryos to have so they can complete their family, or enough viable embryos that then can be tested for genetic conditions. How far should we go with those sorts of things if that becomes a possibility? And I think it's always worth reflecting as well and thinking, some of the things that we may feel a bit icky about now were probably the same, some of the similar, or have similar things to things that people felt icky about when in 1978, before Louise Brown was born. So it's people's views change over time into the acceptability or not of these different uses of the technology.
Yeah, so that brings me on quite nicely to my next question, which is, which uses of IVG do you think are likely to generate the most public interest or the most controversy?
Well, the tabloids love to have a go at older women having babies. A lot of female columnists love to write a column on that. I've seen many over the years when social egg freezing was introduced, and you could store the eggs for up to 55 years. That generated masses of media coverage about that. So I can see that one would be really get people going, as well as multiplex parenting and auto reproduction. I think those would be the three things that people are really bang on about.
I agree with that. I mean, I think the same-sex biological reproduction is probably. I mean, I'm not. Well, I'd like to think, and it probably won't get that level of sort of hostility. I wonder if that could well be presented as it should be, as a good news story, if it can be done safely and effectively, and as part of that sort of equalities journey that we've been on. So I think that would attract interest, but hopefully not hostility on that scale. But yeah, I think the other things Sarah talked about will definitely attract significant negative attention from media.
And has much public attitudes research been undertaken regarding in vitro gametogenesis?
So last year, PET had a little exhibition at the Science Museum in London as part of their Science Late programme, and we asked people there what they thought about the potential uses of IVGs, and so we got about 100 responses to that, and the thing that people were most in favour of, no surprise, was for helping people with total infertility. Then people were also very strongly supported it if it reduced the burden of IVF on women, its use in same-sex female and same-sex male couples. They were not so as strongly in favour of it helping women post-menopausal, normal menopausal age, and they were most against auto-reproduction. But that said, about a third of the people did support auto-reproduction, which really surprised us. So it was interesting, but because I was looking back to 2008, we actually asked the audience at that event some questions as well. I think it was I think we had actually like traffic light cards or something. And so back in 2008, 6% of the audience, and again, that was 86 people, so the percentages aren't, quite right. So take those with a pinch of salt. But 6% voted for a total ban. 53% should it be banned, said artificial gametes should be banned for now, but regulatory making powers should be put in the Act for future use, and 41% thought there should be no specific ban. So it's quite interesting that even going back that far, there was quite positive support. Although, so interesting, but sort of really wide scale public engagement on this in the UK hasn't been done, as far as I'm aware, anyway.
Yes, and we were all at a meeting earlier towards the beginning of middle of last year, weren't we, where there was some social science research presented from the US about particularly, again, going back to this question about using IVG to facilitate same-sex biological families. And this was specifically looking at the people in same-sex relationships to see how keen they were to use it. And I think the findings there was significant enthusiasm amongst a portion of those people. There were also some pushback in terms of concern that you were then sort of adopting a very sort of quite conservative sort of genetic biological model of the family, which there was some hostility to. But yeah, I think you can. I think it'd be welcome more research of that kind, actually, to see who wants to use it and why. I think that will be, and what public views there will be. So they were really interesting findings, Sarah, and particularly what you said about auto reproduction. I think I was expecting a much more hostile figure than that. That's really interesting.
Okay, super. Well, I think that at this point, given that there are quite a lot of questions in the Q&A section, we should probably move over to answering some of those. So I'd like to hand over to my colleague, Dr. Laura O'Donovan.
Thanks, Nicola. Yeah, so we've got two questions in the chat that relate to funding. So I'm going to ask them both because I think they cover related aspects. So the first is, given the problems with NHS funding, is this technology going to be something for the wealthy in society? What problems could this create? And the other question, again about funding, is IVG more economically feasible than current practices? So is it only going to be available for the wealthy, or is it more economically feasible than what we currently have?
So I don't know about you, Steve, but I don't know how much this is going to cost by the time it gets to the clinic and the end user. Usually things are more, new tech is more expensive at the start, and then the price may go plateau or go down. So it's difficult to say what that will be, and of course that will then impact on whether it would be available on the NHS. We have to think that the first 1978 we had the first IVF baby in the UK. 2004 we had the NICE guideline as to how it should, what the access criteria should be, etc., and we still haven't managed to achieve that in 2025. So I think it's going to be a big ask, particularly in the current climate on the NHS. So only if it's going to be able to demonstrate some sort of saving can I see that it would be used instead of IVF, and the access for female or male couples to fertility treatment on the NHS is very poor indeed in the UK.
Yeah, I mean, from a sort of ethics point of view, I mean, I suppose, like, generally speaking, say it should just be subject to the same, cost effectiveness and safety criteria as other treatments in this field. So, I mean, as Sarah indicated, I mean, presumably it's going to be phenomenally expensive for quite a while, and then hopefully there will be a kind of drop in that price as it became, more mainstreamed and more efficient. And as we mentioned earlier, could even be used in, as part of regular IVF in terms of, creating it. It might become a cheaper, safer, better way of creating eggs. That's a theoretical possibility. But yeah, I'm sure it'd be very expensive to start with, and outside the context of research studies, yeah, maybe it won't be an object of public funding because it's so expensive, not because of any particular sort of in principle objection to it.
Okay, that's great. To go back to public attitudes then, I think there's another question here. You've covered most of those aspects regarding what the public might, or what a cross-section of the public might think about some of these potential uses. But the second part of that question is about whether more work to establish public attitudes is needed. And I'd add to that, what do you think that should involve if it is needed? What should that look like?
So I think, I don't know, certainly I think that more public engagement work is needed, whether those are specific focus groups, public dialogue, workshops. I think a whole range of things would be useful to gauge public attitudes towards these things. So I think there's room for surveys as well as these small in-depth focus groups. I don't know what you think about that, Steve.
Yeah, I agree. I think given, with kind of relatively complex technologies like IVG and unfamiliar new ones, yeah, I think that kind of public dialogue approach is probably very welcome, and it's quite sort of resource intensive. But I think, if you can sit down and give people scenarios and information and different perspectives and really sort of get them to take a lot of time to absorb all of that and discuss in small groups and in a larger group, what they think. And so, yeah, I think a really in-depth sort of public dialogue is a really good approach to these kind of issues, because if you just have a survey, then, probably the majority of people will never have heard of IVG, and if they're just engaging with quite short written materials or even short video materials, they might not sort of get it. Whereas I think, given the complexity of it, not only the science but also the social and ethical issues, I think some kind of in-depth public dialogue is a great way forward.
I'd also be really fascinated if there was, as well as with sort of like general representative public, attitudes work done like that, I'd also be really interested in what fertility patients think about this, because whether they are or not in favour, because it's just because they need treatment doesn't necessarily make them pro cutting edge science. So I think that to me personally, that'd be very interesting to see.
Yeah, thanks for that. I think that links to a question that we've got here from Suzanne. It says, you discussed public attitudes research, albeit limited, but what about the views from potential future users in the UK? Noting, Steve, you mentioned some research on this in the US. Can or should we move forward spending resources on the potential use of this technology in the UK before we know that this desire exists? Or can we take desire for this technology from such user groups as a given the possibilities that it opens up?
Well, it'd be good to have that information about user groups, and potentially, maybe that is easier to extract than the public dialogue approach. I say, public dialogue could be a way of doing it, but maybe you can ask people. You can say, would you consider using this if it was an option? So perhaps that isn't so complicated. So yeah, it'd be good to have that information about what demand there is for it. Absolutely. So I don't know what you think, so.
Yeah, I think you've done some work on this, Steve, but given people's overwhelming desire for genetic relatedness to their children, that it seems quite hard to get to the bottom of that overriding desire. I think it sort of wouldn't be surprising if they were in favour of that. And I think for people who go through fertility treatment are unsuccessful and realize that donation is the way forward, they often go through, they often find that difficult to move to donor gametes because of that. So I think there will be, I wouldn't be surprised that there'd be a strong desire from the patients.
Yeah, I think I mean, I think it's, there are clearly a large number of people who would prefer to be genetically related to their own children. So, I mean, you can question that and whether that's a good preference to have, but clearly lots of people do have it. And so absolutely, I think IVG would be in principle wanted by those people, although again, it's going to depend on things like safety, cost and so on. But in the more distant future, if it became well established, I think it would be an attractive option for a lot of people.
And I suppose that gives, rise to the problems with accessibility and the false hope that potentially this technology may give to people, and actually cause more upset if it, is something that is never going to be affordable or available to them.
That's great, thanks. We've got some questions now, moving on to sort of look at this comparison with other methods for donor conception. So if this technology could potentially make gamete donation obsolete, what implications might that have for existing families through donor conception and donor conceived people?
I'm not sure that we'd ever quite get rid of gamete donation at a stroke. I think it would be because I think the difficulties in creating sperm from a woman, for example. I think that's something that's been put in the chat. Some of these things, biologically incredibly difficult. But I think also, if you're a single woman wanting a child, then you'd still need a donor. You might, that might be, just a sperm donor, and not that might be a cheaper option than using IVG. And also, they may not want to choose to go through a licensed clinic, and not everybody wants to do that. So I think there'll always be some donation in that regard. What it means for the parents of donor conceived families and the donor conceived at the moment, I think they'll just continue to have their very strong communities that they have, and through the support of organisations like the Donor Conception Network. So I don't see anything particularly changing there.
No, I totally agree. I think that's I totally agree with what Sarah said. I mean, you can imagine maybe you can imagine a much more distant future scenario where IVG becomes very, very mainstream, very easy, very cheap, where the numbers of donor conceived offspring, drop dramatically. And I guess at that point, if it became more unusual, perhaps there would be some concerns about that community being more marginalized. But I think that's a very distant in time possibility, for all the pragmatic reasons Sarah gave.
Okay, we've got another comment here about donor conception. It's more of a comment than a question, but I do wonder if you have any reflections. So it's from Natalie, and it says, initially, when using donor gametes, recipient parents were advised to keep quiet about it, but the research now suggests the opposite, that children fare better when they know they are donor conceived. If IVG babies become common many years in the future, there will need to be a whole new narrative about the birds and the bees for children at school, or even for the general public to understand it. presumably the same issue about transparency would apply the same here as with donor babies. I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that.
I think, yes, Natalie, I think it is the same. And so I think, we can learn lessons again from the past, but also here there's not, well, depending on the family setup, there may not be the big reveal that that one of your parents is not a genetic parent, because here the ambition is that you are genetically related to both or all four of your parents. So slightly different, but it's yes, I mean, telling people, I think people, from my experience, find it easier to tell children that, this would be perhaps more akin to telling your children they were born as a result of IVF, because there isn't that extra complicated bit. This is just sort of IVF with knobs on. It's more complicated, and that's what it is, rather than, oh yes, and there's a consequence to this because you'll get this information at a certain age. All that will go.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think the comparison with IVF works really well because, yeah, as I mean, in cases where IVG is used to, if you like, reinforce the biological family, so the social family is also the genetic family. That's quite different from revealing that there's somebody outside that group who provided the genetic material. So yeah, it's more akin to something technical in the reproductive process, which the child might not be too concerned about. Having said that, I mean, it's not my area of research, but everything I've heard from people who do this research suggests that, yeah, I mean, being open and transparent and honest from an early age is good for outcomes and good for well-being. So, given that, absolutely, I think parents should be open about IVG.
Yeah, and I wonder actually if instead of conversations around sort of the right to know your genetic origins, actually what we'll move to is a right to know sort of about how you came to be, right? The method in which you were created. So we've got some questions now about sort of introduction and regulation. So Vicky asks, do you have any concerns about the impact developing reproductive technologies may have on each other? For example, people may be in favour of IVG, but this, in addition to artificial placentas, for example, could be too much and tip the scale against the technology. Do you think each technology needs to be introduced slowly and separately, or could a combined introduction garner more favour?
I guess if you're simultaneously using two experimental or very new technologies on the same future personal fetus or embryo, I guess presumably that magnifies the risk and creates a great deal of complexity. So from a sort of safety and research methodology point of view, I would have thought, although again this is definitely not my research area, keeping them separate is a good idea, because then you're not compounding the risk and you're not causing interference between the two research programs. So probably yes, but that's a kind of as I say, I'm not speaking from any kind of methodological expertise on that. I don't know what you think, Sarah.
Now, I'd be speaking from the same lack of expertise, but it seems it would seem more sensible to have things separate, to have to test, to go ahead before you do that. And I think trying to introduce all things at once in the sort of way that was outlined in the question, I think is actually quite problematic.
Mm-hmm. I mean, the question is more about regulation, then I guess perhaps a slightly different thing kicks in there, which is, I mean, probably it's a good idea to have a very wide-ranging, comprehensive set of regulatory and legal reforms rather than just doing one at a time. So I mean, that maybe a different thing applies there, which is you want actually a big coherent system that can deal with all these different things coming in from different places and which is consistent and coherent and treats them all based on similar underlying principles. So if the question is more about that, then I think we should take them, we should do horizon scanning really and just see what's coming in and try and come up with a framework that's going to cope with all of these new things coming in.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay,
I was just going to, thanks for that, Steve. That actually leads us into the final question that we've got here, which is the UK has the HFEA, but not everywhere has such good regulation. What concerns do the speakers have for unregulated use? So that's our final question. Worries about unregulated use of this technology, as not everywhere has a robust regulatory authority overseeing activities in this area like the HFEA.
Well, for me, the biggest concern would be patient safety and the outcome of the pregnancy, if that's achieved, and the possibility that people will be, sort of in effect missold this technology. So I think that is for me the big thing, as we've seen in sort of some areas of stem cells, all sorts of rogue treatments in different countries. So that's what would be my concern.
Yes, totally agree. I mean, this is one of the issues where we do have experience and models from other technologies. So I mean, there's lots been written and researched about cross-border reproductive travel and the kind of pros and cons of that, and the risks that it can lead to. So yeah, I mean, there are risks of it being used in an unregulated way, either with UK people going to other countries or just in other countries. So as we mentioned earlier, it could well be the first clinical use of this, could well be sort of outside a regulated context for somebody who's just very keen to make it happen. So I guess I'm worried about it to some extent. Yeah.
Okay, so in order to allow us to finish on time today, I just want to thank the speakers during today's session. It's been really interesting to hear about the ethical, social, and legal questions that in vitro gametogenesis raises, and also to thank those who participated in the session and asked some really fascinating questions. So thank you, everyone, and we look forward to seeing you perhaps during our next webinar. If you'd like to find out more about the things that we've been doing as part of the Future of Human Reproduction grant, you can visit our website or visit our LinkedIn page. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thanks.